It started the way so many late-night internet rabbit holes do. I was scrolling, half tired, half curious, and suddenly this clip appeared. For a split second, I honestly thought it was parody or AI. You know that feeling when something looks real, but your instincts whisper, no, that can't be right. That was me. I remember staring at the screen thinking, why does this feel off in a way I can't explain? Pregnancy is supposed to be one of the most universal human experiences. Different for everyone, yes, but grounded in a shared reality. And yet this story never seemed to sit still. One moment it felt glossy and curated, glowing smiles, designer dresses, fairy tale framing. The next, it shifted into something darker, heavier, almost tragic. Same person, same pregnancy, completely different emotional weather. I kept going back to that appearance at Royal Albert Hall. Do you remember it? People still argue about how far along she was meant to be. Early weeks, according to one timeline. But visually, it told a very different story. And once you notice it, you can't unsee it. That's when doubt quietly moves in, not loudly, not accusingly, just a soft question tapping at the back of your mind. What made it stranger was how the narrative kept reshaping itself. One interview leaned into warmth and humor, cravings, late nights, playful vulnerability. Another reframed the same period as isolating, overwhelming, even traumatic. Supporters tried to reconcile it. Critics leaned forward. And somewhere in between, ordinary viewers like us were left trying to hold all these versions in our heads at once. That's where Tom Bauer enters the picture, not as a fire starter, but as a quiet observer. He doesn't shout fraud or wave conspiracy flags. He does something far more unsettling. He lines things up, quote beside quote, appearance beside appearance, timeline next to timeline, and then he steps back. The effect is subtle but powerful, because the questions form themselves. Think about the hospital story for a moment. Royal protocols quietly set aside. Medical details that seem to change depending on the platform. One version feels almost cinematic, light-hearted banter, in-and-out ease. Another version, told later, sounds like a high-risk ordeal that would normally involve long monitoring and serious concern. Doctors listening raised eyebrows. Mothers listening pause the video. Something didn't align. And then there's the calendar. Dates that feel flexible. Announcements that don't quite sit where you expect them to. Memories of nesting that don't line up with public schedules. Online, people started building digital corkboards, matching photos to headlines, interviews to official events. Not to attack, but to understand. Because when stories are true, they usually settle. These ones kept moving. Even the tone kept evolving. Early on, it was bright and aspirational. Later, it became somber, reflective, wounded. Each retelling carried a slightly different emotional weight, almost as if the story itself was being rewritten to meet the moment. A new audience, a new lens, a new version of vulnerability. And here's the thing that lingers. This isn't really about biology or bump photos or timelines on a spreadsheet. It's about trust. When stories matter, when they are tied to identity and credibility, consistency becomes everything. Once that consistency fractures, even gently, people start to listen differently. They lean in, not because they want drama, but because humans are wired to sense when something isn't whole. By the time the story circles back again, years later, it feels heavier. Not because of what's added, but because of what's already there. The unanswered questions, the emotional pivots, the details that never quite lock into place. Archie remains at the center of it all, symbolic of a narrative that was meant to be simple, joyful, unquestionable. And maybe that's why this conversation refuses to fade. Not because of scandal headlines or internet speculation, but because deep down, we all recognize the feeling of a story being shaped instead of remembered. And once you sense that, once that quiet doubt takes root, it's almost impossible to silence. It stopped being about memory the moment the story started changing its clothes. Not small edits, not human fuzziness, but full emotional wardrobe changes. And that's the part that lingers. Because when recollection turns into reinvention, you can feel it, even if you can't immediately explain why. Tom Bauer noticed it early. Not with accusations, not with outrage, but with that quiet precision he's known for. He watched how emotion became the lever. One year, Meghan Markle was framed as a radiant emblem of modern motherhood. The next, she appeared as someone barely surviving the weight of attention. Same chapter of life, completely different emotional lighting. And each version seemed to find its audience effortlessly. Admiration here, sympathy there, skepticism everywhere in between. To Bauer, that didn't feel accidental. It felt choreographed. Spend enough time watching the interviews and you start to sense it too. Not that something is wrong, exactly, just that something keeps shifting. Every retelling seems tuned to provoke a specific response. Not truth versus lie, but resonance versus reaction. The story stops being about pregnancy and starts behaving like a mirror, reflecting back whatever version of herself fits the moment. What makes it more compelling is what isn't said. Because for every emotional deep dive, there's a logistical detail that never quite arrives. A date that stays soft. A process that's glossed over. A question answered sideways with a smile. Bauer doesn't frame these gaps as deception. He frames them as silence. And silence, he suggests, can be louder than confession. There's a strange power in selective storytelling. When one interview dwells on pain but skips the practical realities, the omission becomes its own message. Viewers lean in, not because they are being told something shocking, but because they sense something missing. Some call it privacy. Others call it strategy. Either way, the effect is the same. The unanswered questions echo. This is where Bauer's method becomes almost surgical. He never raises his voice. He never labels intent. He simply arranges words in the order they were spoken and steps back. Chronology becomes a spotlight. Contradictions don't need commentary. They breathe on their own. And suddenly the audience doesn't feel like it's being persuaded. It feels like it's discovering. That restraint is a brilliance. By refusing to conclude, he hands a conclusion to the viewer. People don't feel lectured. They feel involved. Like detectives connecting dots they weren't even sure existed a moment earlier. It's not an attack. It's architecture. And the deeper pattern starts to emerge. The stories don't evolve by accident. They adapt. Strength during backlash. Vulnerability during scandal. Empowerment during reinvention. Bauer doesn't call this lying. He frames it as instinct. A performer's instinct. The ability to reshape a single experience into multiple emotional outcomes, each one polished for maximum impact. That instinct is powerful. It can make someone unforgettable. It can also make their timeline impossible to anchor. One event becomes many reflections, all convincing, none identical. And as those reflections multiply, trust becomes harder to hold on to. Online, the story takes on a life of its own. Clips circulate. Quotes get dissected. Context stretches and snaps. The narrative no longer belongs to the people at its center, including Prince Harry or their son Archie. It belongs to the audience now. To podcasts, comment sections, reaction videos. Each unanswered question becomes fuel. Not for resolution, but for engagement. That's the real twist. The fascination isn't driven by proof anymore. It's driven by perception. What feels consistent? What feels rehearsed? What feels unfinished? Some viewers see careful curation. Others see unfair scrutiny. The debate never settles because the story never settles. And maybe that's the point Bauer leaves us with. Not a revelation about documents or doctors or dates, but a psychological insight. A narrative that refuses to land creates perpetual motion. Silence feeds curiosity. Emotion replaces evidence. Attention becomes a currency. Even when nothing new is said, the echo continues. Because in the digital age, a mystery doesn't need to be solved. It just needs to stay alive. And this one does. Not by exploding, but by constantly changing shape. Every new interview, every carefully chosen detail, every pause where an answer might have been, keeps the audience leaning forward. Bauer didn't expose a single inconsistency. He exposed a cycle. A loop where storytelling itself becomes the headline. And whether you see that as manipulation or mastery, one thing is undeniable. Once you notice the pattern, you can't unsee it. And that's why this story doesn't fade. It doesn't end. It just keeps becoming something else. They always say the truth never comes out. That some doors stay closed because what's behind them is too dangerous, too destabilizing, too wrapped in power to ever see daylight. And yet here we are, staring at a question that refuses to stay quiet. Not shouted, Not proven, just lingering. Did the story we were given fully reflect reality, or did it leave something important unsaid? I remember the first time I read the announcement. It was beautiful, gentle, and almost poetic. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry welcoming their daughter, Lilibet, into the world. Most people smiled and moved on. That's what announcements are meant to do. But a few longtime royal watchers paused. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. For centuries, royal birth notices followed a rigid formula. Not for romance, not for drama, but for certainty. A simple confirmation that grounded everything. The mother was safely delivered. Doctors present. Reality anchored. This time, that line never appeared. Not once. Some dismissed it as modern wording. Others noticed something subtler. The palace echoed the same phrasing almost exactly. And when institutions built on protocols suddenly go minimalist, people start to wonder why. This is where Tom Bauer enters the conversation. Not with accusations, not with medical claims, but with questions. He doesn't say this happened. He asks, why was this different? And sometimes that's more unsettling, because a question invites you to look again, to reread, to notice patterns you might have brushed aside the first time. Whispers followed. Not headlines, not sworn testimony, just murmurs from people who claim proximity to daily life. Stories that didn't match the polished public images. Observations that felt ordinary on their own, but strange when placed next to the official narrative. None of it is proof. All of it tension. The kind that sits in your chest because you can't quite resolve it. Then there were documents that circulated online. Screenshots, numbers, codes most people would never notice. Some said they contradicted public timelines. Others argued they were misunderstood or misread. And that's the thing about numbers. They feel authoritative, even when interpretation is disputed. Once they enter the conversation, doubt doesn't need certainty to grow. It just needs inconsistency. People asked about witnesses, about doctors, about details that normally become footnotes of history. Instead, they felt absent. Not denied, just not elaborated. Silence again. And silence is a way of amplifying whatever fear or suspicion someone already carries. More extreme claims surfaced too. Allegations about medical history, whispered without evidence, repeated without verification. These are the moments where the line blurs between inquiry and imagination. Bauer never adopts those claims as fact. He doesn't need to. He understands something fundamental about modern storytelling. Once a narrative feels incomplete, others will rush in to fill the gaps. Not always responsibly, not always truthfully. And that's where this stops being about one birth or one announcement. It becomes about trust. About how stories are told in the age of branding and perception. About how omission can feel as powerful as deception, even when no deception is proven. When details are withheld, intentionally or not, audiences don't just accept the mystery. They participate in it. What Bauer ultimately exposes isn't a secret file or a smoking gun. It's a pattern, a way of communicating that prioritizes emotional impact over grounding detail. A style where narratives adapt to context, audience, and moment. That doesn't automatically mean something is false, but it does mean it's harder to anchor. And once people feel unanchored, they don't let go. They replay interviews. They compare statements. They argue online. The story takes on a life of its own, no longer controlled by press releases or official wording. Even silence becomes content, especially silence. That's why this conversation refuses to end. Not because there's a proven revelation waiting to explode, but because the story never settles into something solid enough to rest on. It keeps shifting shape. Each retelling, each pause, each carefully chosen word adds another layer. So maybe the most uncomfortable truth isn't about what happened in the delivery room. Maybe it's about how easily narratives can float free of verification when emotion leads and structure steps back. In a world that runs on attention, mystery doesn't need resolution. It just needs momentum. And this one still has it. There's a moment in every story where silence stops feeling accidental and starts feeling intentional. That's when people lean in. Not because they've been told something shocking, but because nothing is being said at all. After the announcement, everything went quiet. Not celebratory quiet. Not protective quiet. Just empty. Fans noticed it first. Then royal watchers. then journalists who'd seen dozens of royal births come and go. Every statement was polished, gentle, careful, and somehow managed to confirm nothing while implying everything. It was a language of omission, a way of speaking without ever standing still long enough to be held to a fact. And that's when the whispers from Montecito began to circulate. Not shouted, not sworn, just shared in low voices by people who claimed they were there every day. One account kept resurfacing. A staff member describing ordinary mornings, ordinary movement, ordinary routines. No visible strain, no preparation, no visible change that matched the public timeline. Then months later, the documentary images appeared, perfectly framed, perfectly shaped, and the disconnect became impossible to ignore for those who had seen both realities. On their own, stories like that don't prove anything. They rarely do, but when they sit beside other unanswered questions, they begin to hum. Requests for clarification were met with polite deflection. Even formal inquiries were redirected. This information, people were told, sat with Buckingham Palace, beyond public reach, not denied, just inaccessible. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Because silence, when it's carefully constructed, carries weight. It creates space. And into that space, speculation rushes. Old claims resurface. Unverified family anecdotes. Rumors about medical history that were never documented, never proven, but never fully extinguished either. Whispers that, if true, would explain why a single sentence never appeared in any announcement. Not because of style, but because confirmation would have meant responsibility. This is where Tom Bauer's approach feels almost unsettling in its restraint. He doesn't validate the rumors. He doesn't repeat them as fact. He simply asks why the system behaved the way it did. Why wording mattered so much. Why witnesses faded from view. Why verification, the one thing institutions usually cling to, was so carefully avoided. He lets the audience sit with the discomfort instead of resolving it for them. Online, the effect was immediate. Screenshots, side-by-side comparisons. People arguing not over what was true, but over what was knowable. Some accused the palace of protection. Others accused critics of obsession. But both sides agreed on one thing. No one could definitively confirm what had happened. And for an institution built on lineage and certainty, that ambiguity felt seismic. As more alleged messages and fragments surfaced, redacted and contextless, the story expanded beyond any single individual. It became about systems, about how power manages risk, about how history can be softened not by rewriting facts, but by never fully stating them in the first place. Fewer witnesses, fewer records,